Welcome back to another episode of Mormon Traditionalist Podcast. My name is Jaron O'Driscoll, and I am your host. And today we are finishing up the rest of our conversation with Jonathan Neville. There's a lot of great stuff in here, guys, along with what might just be the answer to what happened to the gold plates and the contents of the repository. Buckle up, guys. Here we go. So, we kind of went into that a little bit about, and we could do a whole episode on that and the information that is omitted in all of this stuff. We could probably do a multi-part series on all that kind of information.
Let me tell you just one more thing about that, because one of the knocks always on the whole Heartland idea has been that the scriptures describe a narrow neck of land that had to be in Central America. And so my wife...
Panama.
Panama. It started with Panama, and then it ended up at the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and other parts of Central America. So my wife gave me the challenge. She said, well, why don't you go through the Book of Mormon and find how the geography is described? So I did that. And there's a book I published called Moroni's America. There's a webpage about it as well. And I went through every geographical passage in the entire Book of Mormon, and my conclusion was that it describes North America perfectly. Now, I'll give you one example, and that is that one of the key features in the Book of Mormon is that the land of Zarahemla is lower than the land of Nephi, because I always talk about going down into Zarahemla and up to the land of Nephi. And so the Mesoamerican scholars concluded that there was a river along we can tell from the text that Zarahemla is on a river, but they concluded that if the land of Nephi was higher, that the source of the river had to be in the land of Nephi, and then it had to flow down to Zarahemla, which meant that it was a north-flowing river. And I thought, I could see their reasoning for that. And so what I realized when I was going through this analysis of the geography passages is that there's a major north-flowing river in North America that everybody forgot about, and it's called the Tennessee River. If you go to Tennessee, which we think is where the land of Nephi was for lots of reasons, but they escaped from the land of Nephi to go to the land of Zarahemla. They went north by going down the Tennessee River, and it flows right up to southern Illinois, which is the land of Zarahemla. So out here in the West, we don't think of that because we think the Mississippi River and Ohio River and the Missouri River all basically flowing south. But if you live in the East, and I lived in Tennessee when I was a kid, so none of this was that unusual to me. I knew the Tennessee River flows north, and then all the geography aligns perfectly. I mean, it's awesome how it works. So that was one of the big clues. Another is recognizing that the Nephites traveled by boats. Mormon said he didn't take the time to talk about all their building of ships and stuff.
Yep.
But he did allude to it. And once you realize that ancient people mostly traveled by rivers, there's an abundance of waterways throughout North America. In Central America, not so much. It's very mountainous, very difficult to cross. They didn't have the accessibility to one another and to travel the way they do in North America. And once you understand that, then the whole text of the Book of Mormon just becomes crystal clear.
Yeah, and I really love the Moroni's America. I have the pocket edition, and I love having that for reference with all this stuff. And I actually highly recommend all you guys look into that. That's what we'll talk about some of Jonathan's book here at the end, but that's one personally I have that I keep on hand that I look through for reference for this kind of stuff. But yeah, there's a lot of things like that just bear witness to where this all happened, into the Heartland model. And it gets kind of overwhelming at times when you first get into this and start looking into it. There's so much to it, and it also adds credence and authenticity to the Book of Mormon itself. It's so complex and so rich, and if Joseph Smith made it all up, he had to have been the greatest con man or the luckiest man of all time. So
and they talk about all the evidence in Central America. There's far more evidence in North America that corroborates the Book of Mormon. And
unfortunately, it wasn't around as much back then, right? We had all of these amazing discoveries of these temples in South America, and going into, we won't go into it, but into Benjamin Winchester and all that, people that were holding on to that really wanted that to be the truth, and maybe even had good intentions, but it just wasn't the right thing. But now that And we won't go into the wanton destruction and any of that, but there's so much of it that just, it was there back then that people knew about it and saw it. Artifacts were plentiful back then, but fields get plowed. People are poor. They pick up copper artifacts. They use them. They smelt them down. They sell them. There's just not a whole lot left anymore, unfortunately. So wrapping up here, Jonathan, really appreciate your time. There's one of your books that I haven't read yet called Whatever Happened to the Golden Plates. And I don't want you to give too much away here, but what do we know about the repository and what was in it and what happened to it after?
Okay, so this one this gets back to what I mentioned earlier about Brigham Young describing what Oliver had told him about all the records that were found, or that Oliver and Joseph saw in the repository in the Hill Gamora. And that the book that I wrote there explains the concept of the two sets of plates and how we can tell, at least based on the historical sources that we have, that there were two separate sets of plates. And what's fascinating about it, when Brigham Young said that he was trying to describe how many plates there were, he said there were many wagon loads. And I think Heber C. Kimball said more than a 6-mule team can carry. And so I started thinking, well, wait a minute, how would he relate how many plates there were in terms of wagon loads, unless maybe Joseph and Oliver and Joseph's brothers moved all those plates? And so here's kind of this is speculative, obviously.
Right, of course.
But we know that Mormon said that he moved all of the Nephite records from the Hill Shem to Gamora, which meant that wherever the Hill Shem was, there was a cave that was, or an underground room of some sort that was large enough to hold all the plates. When Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were getting ready to leave the Palmyra area, there had already been people trying to dig up the Hill Gamora looking for treasure. And there was an account of people going up there at night with their torches and while they're digging and so on. And I could see why the Lord would want them to move those plates back to the Hill Shem. And so based on what Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball and Wilford Wood have said, it sounds like there was some measurement in terms of how many wagon loads of plates there were to move back to the Hill Shem. And we don't know where the Hill Shem is. We don't know if they moved them all. But Oliver Cowdery did make an interesting point in that letter number 8. He said some places are sacred because of what is still there, and other places are sacred for what used to be there. And he knew that the plates used to be in the Hill Gamora, but they were no longer there. And David Whitmer was asked about where the plates were, and he said, well, they're in New York. And they said, well, where in New York? Are they in Gamora? And he said, no, but they're not far from there. So David Whitmer knew that the plates are no longer in Gamora, but he knew they were not far from there. So he never specifically said that he knew where Joseph and Oliver had taken them, but it's pretty easy to put 2 and 2 together.
Yeah.
That they moved them back to the Hill Shem.
That's a really fascinating thought to think about. I never really put that together because I've read those that Brigham Young said, and I think some of them said there's more than 10 men could carry out and
right.
wagon loads. That's a really fascinating thought. And what that makes me think of, and I think people don't really put this together and understand, Mormon abridged those records for us in our day.
Mm-hmm.
What he put in there, we hear that throughout our lives. The Book of Mormon's for us. It's for our day. We should, anything that happens, we can apply to our day. I don't think people really understand the magnitude of what was there and available for Mormon to pull from.
Right.
They said so many times in the Book of Mormon, a 100th part of our history I cannot tell you. And I think that gives some credence just to how direct, because Mormon saw our day, right? He was shown our day by the Lord, and he knew what was going to happen. And he had this huge room, this however many wagon loads of plates to choose from.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that's a really incredible thing to understand and realize. How long has the idea of the repository been around? How long has that been widely known?
Well, as far as, back in the day, Oliver Cowdery is the one who told Brigham Young about it, and David Whitmer. So they've known about it ever since the early 1830s.
It's just never become super mainstream.
Yeah, well, I think it was widely known among the saints even in Utah in the early days. Although Brigham Young had to make a point of it in his sermon. It's in the Journal of Discourses for everyone to read. But he was afraid the knowledge would be lost because that first generation was dying off who had personal knowledge of it. And so, and you can see why David Whitmer would not want to talk about specifics about where the places were moved, because he still considered the Book of Mormon to the end of his life to be the Word of God and a sacred book. And he didn't want to violate any of the commandments he'd been given, as a witness. And of course, Martin Harris, we don't know if he ever was clued in on the whole thing about the repository, but David Whitmer certainly knew about it. And so I think it's it really, the knowledge of it wasn't really lost until maybe 30, 40 years ago. In fact, I have a seminary manual, I think it's from 1979, that includes this account from Brigham Young, right in the seminary manual.
Wow.
And then it was taken out in the 80s and 90s because of this Mesoamerican thing, where they started saying, well, the real Cumorah is not in New York, it's down in Mexico. So the correlation committee went through and basically decorrelated the Hill Cumorah from all the materials. But I still have the seminary manual. I mean, when I was in seminary, we all learned what Brigham Young said because it was part of the curriculum, put it that way. So the knowledge, Brigham Young's concern about it being lost was about 100 years ahead of his time, because he talked about that, as I recall, in 1879. And it was about 1979 was the last time it was published by CES. Since then, it's been all decorrelated. So, Brigham Young was prophetic in his concern about the knowledge of Cumorah being lost, for sure.
Well, that's interesting. I think that's really important for people to understand, and maybe something that needs to become more well known again. That it just really struck me and hit me that if there was that much to pull from, that it's got to be more tailored to our day than I think that most people would want to admit or accept.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. It's, I like to say that if Martin Harris had lost, say, King Benjamin's address instead of the 116 pages, the messenger could have gone back into the repository and found the original of King Benjamin's address. There was a backup plan, no matter. Well, let me back up. I don't think that Martin Harris was predestined to lose 116 pages. I think no matter what he had lost, if anything, the Lord had a backup plan, a very practical backup plan. It was like the repository was there. So anything that was in the abridgment that was lost, the original could be restored. But what that means is, to your point, is that everything Mormon put in the abridgment, he put for a specific reason. And so it was to prepare us really for our own day, but also to testify of Christ to the convincing of Jew and Gentile, as the title page says. And so everything he put in there, he really had a specific editorial objective of witnessing of the restoration and of convincing everyone in the world that Jesus is the Christ. And he designed his abridgment to accomplish that.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. One last question of curiosity here before we close up. Do we know anything about, you spoke about people digging on the Hill Cumorah back in Joseph Smith's time. Lots of artifacts have been found in the heartland, and a lot of it was lost to that era. Has anything been done that we know of on Hill Cumorah after, because the church acquired it? Originally it was owned by the RLDS church. The church acquired it later on. Am I wrong on that?
Yeah, originally it was owned by Pliny Sexton, as I recall. I'd have to make sure all the dates. But when Willard Bean went out there to be a missionary in Palmyra, at one point the church told him they wanted him to try to buy the hill, and he tried and tried and tried, and finally We don't need to get through the details. People can look that up. But he was finally able to make the arrangement to buy the Hill Gamora from the owner. And so it was never owned by the RLDS Church. In fact, by then, the RLDS Church wasn't that interested in the Hill Gamora anymore. But Joseph F. Smith, Hiram's son, who was president of the church, really wanted to buy the Hill Gamora. And so there's a miraculous story about how that came to pass. We don't have time to get into, but they were able to acquire the Hill Gamora. And, there's Willard Bean and his family talked about all the artifacts that were just abundant in the area. Willard's son used to use the arrowheads as skipping stones because they were so abundant in the ponds out there. His sister or his daughter, I don't remember which, said they used to dig up these big skulls that were so big you could put them over their heads like football helmets for the kids.
Wow.
And there's lots of accounts of those around the Midwest, but this is right in the Palmyra area that they used to do that. And the farmers would dig up lots of arrowheads. In fact, I was working with the state archaeologist out of University of Buffalo out there, and he gave me a list of all the Hopewell sites that were in western New York. The Hopewell Indians are the ones who lived in Ohio primarily. But around 300 or 400 AD, they kind of migrated towards western New York and vanished. Well, some of their sites have been documented by the archaeologists. And when I was with him once, we went to a site and he was just scrounging around in the dirt, picked out an arrowhead and gave it to me. He said they're all over here. Now, a lot of those are post-Book of Mormon times, of course, but the Hopewell dated to Book of Mormon times. And those are well-known sites in western New York. So, the idea that I know there's a BYU archaeologist, anthropologist who claims that Gamora was a clean hill. And I've discussed this on my blog in some detail, his report. But it was really a superficial report because he was convinced that the real Hill Gamora was in Mexico. But if he had done his due diligence and really investigated it, he would have found that there was an abundance of artifacts right around the Hill Gamora, as well as throughout western New York.
So had it been gone through pretty well before the church took possession of it?
Oh yeah. Although, okay, here's two other accounts, and these to some degree these are anecdotal, but these are ones that I've heard directly. I don't have any reason to dispute them, but I haven't seen them myself. I've been told that when they dug the foundation for the Moroni statue on top of the Hill Gamora, they had to dig down pretty deep and to put a bunch of concrete, because there's a big, tall, heavy statue. Well, they broke into an underground chamber when they did that, when they were digging down. And I'm told that they just filled it with cement. And I don't know if they did that because they didn't know about the chamber that Brigham Young had talked about, or if they were told to just fill it with cement, who knows? But that's the story. And it makes sense because some years, I guess 15, 20 years ago now, during the preparations for the pageant, a kid fell into a hole there on the kind of the western side of the Hill Gamora and fell into a room. And I have pictures of the room, and they had to pull him out with a rope, but it was described as about 16 feet by 16 feet, which is the dimensions that Wilford Woodruff said, Oliver Cowdery said it was. And no one thought much of it because it was empty. But what they didn't realize is Oliver Cowdery said the records were no longer there. So the room was still there, but the records were not there. And so that's an interesting account. Another one is that when they dug the road going up to the top of the Hill Gamora, there's a parking area up on top for the tour buses and people to drive their cars. When they were digging the road to go up there, they dug up lots of artifacts in terms of like arrowheads, atlatl heads, that type of thing. And they boxed them up. And Willard Bean's daughter or granddaughter saw the box and asked about it. And they said, yeah, we dug these all up. We're going to send them out to Salt Lake. So it's kind of like an Indiana Jones thing. Whatever happened to the box of artifacts from Gamora, right? Most likely what happened is whoever got them handed them out as souvenirs, because that's usually what happens. But even still, from time to time, this same archaeologist told me from the state of New York, I had a house out there. It was just less than a mile from Gamora. And he told me that if I wanted to find some arrowheads in the spring, I should just follow the farmers when they plow up the fields, because they're constantly plowing up arrowheads, which I never was there at the right time to do that. But that's what he told me anyway. So
those are a couple of really incredible stories. And like you said, take them for what they are, right? It is anecdotal, but if those are accurate, that gives a lot of credence to exactly what the prophet had said.
Yeah. And, speaking of Gamora, I'll mention one other thing. Not everybody agrees with me on this, but at the end of the Nephite time in Mormon 6, he describes that he could see his 10,000 and Moroni's 10,000 from the top of the hill Gamora. And some people think that's literally 10,000 people. But that doesn't make sense to me. I think it was just a military unit. And as an example, I referred to Xenophon, who was a Greek author I had to read when I studied Greek. He wrote a book called the Anabasis, and they had units of 10,000 men. And that was a common round number that they would use. It's kind of like a platoon, let's say. And so they went on this military campaign. By the time they came back, there were only about 6,000 men in each platoon, but they still called them the 10,000. And so when Mormon and Moroni referred to their 10,000, they were referring to their platoons, let's say, or their companies. Doesn't mean there were 10,000 men and not 10,001 or 9,999. Those are just numbers describing a military unit. So it could have been as few as a few thousand that were left in the final battle. And so the other one related to that is Mormon talks about the other 23 generals or leaders who had their own 10,000 who were killed. And when I read that, I think he's reflecting back on his entire career, starting when he was he 14 when he became a general to begin with?
14 or 15, yeah.
14 or 15. So he had commanders for his entire career, over 40 or 50 years, that had been lost in these ongoing battles with the Lamanites, particularly toward the end. And so that doesn't mean there were 230,000 people killed at Gamora. It could have been as few as maybe 15,000. And Oliver Cowdery made a real clear distinction in letter 7. He said that the bodies of thousands of Jaredites, which means less than tens of thousands, so thousands of Jaredites. And if you go to the Book of Ether, he gives you the account for the last 3 days of how many people were killed. And if you extrapolate that back a week, because it was a week-long battle, you can see that the number is under 10,000, which is what Oliver Cowdery described it. And then he said tens of thousands of the bodies of the Nephites and Lamanites, which is less than 100,000. And so when I read that, I think, okay, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30,000, maybe 40,000 of the combined armies of Lamanites and Nephites killed there at Gamora. That's a number that makes sense, is consistent with the archaeological evidence and the anthropological evidence in that area. Because it's well known that there were hilltop forts all through western New York that date to Book of Mormon times, but they were fairly rudimentary. They were not a major civilization. So one of the arguments that the Mazo guys give for Gamora being in Mexico was there had to be 500,000 people killed at this site, which is impossible for New York. And I agree with them that it's impossible for New York, but that's not what the text says in the first place. Kind of like when they'll say, well, Gamora can't be in New York because there's no volcanoes there. And I say, well, there's no volcanoes in the Book of Mormon. So
right.
It's the same with the numbers of people. The Book of Mormon does not say that many people were killed at Gamora. And with the number that it does say were killed there is consistent with the evidence. So I just look at the whole thing as being a really exciting time for us to see that the words and the teachings of the prophets are being vindicated in our day, right before our eyes, if we just take the time to look.
Yeah, we got to be looking in the right place for sure. We will have to have you on again, Jonathan, and maybe talk some more about this topic specifically. I'm super interested in a lot of the Book of Mormon howlers and kind of the what the Meso guys will say and tell you, and being able to push back against why they say the Heartland model isn't viable. We'll have to have you back on.
Let me just say one thing on that. As far as I'm concerned, the debate is over. I mean, the Meso thing makes no sense, and more people are realizing that. So now it's a question of how do we fit it in with what we know of the Hopewell and Adena civilizations. And that's where the exciting stuff is happening, because there's so many cool things happening in that arena. I don't even spend any time thinking about Mesoamerica anymore. It's just so ridiculous. But the other thing that I'd like to talk to you about sometime is the whole translation and the evidence that Joseph actually translated the plates, because that's my latest book, my thing I'm real excited about right now, because it's also an entree into the world of Christianity in a broader sense. Well, you have to leave that as a teaser for next time.
Well, definitely.
I look forward to talking about that one.
We'll plan on doing that. So what are some of your other books here? Some of the ones we talked about, Moroni's America. I love the pocket edition. I keep that on my truck and reference that whenever I have time. It's a really cool read. You did a book on Letter 7. We talked about that a little bit. Mm-hmm. We'll put all of these in the show notes for you guys. And first off, where can they get your books? Where do you have them?
They have my Deseret book, Amazon, direct from the publisher, which is Digital Legend. Any of those places. Those are the main three places people buy them. It seems like most people now like the digital ones, which are available on Kindle. But yeah, you can get them at Deseret Book if you're in Utah or a place where there's a Deseret Book, or you can order them from Deseret Book.
We'll put links in the show notes for all of those where they can order them online.
Okay.
And A Man That Can Translate, that was another one. I have not read that one yet. Can you tell us a little bit about what that entails? We're doing Reader's Digest on all these.
Yeah, that one, that's a good point. A Man That Can Translate is my analysis of the evidence that Joseph Smith actually translated the plates. And
not dictated.
He dictated, but he translated and dictated. He didn't just transcribe it, in other words. So, yeah, I getting to your point. So there's a stone in the hat idea going around, right? That the words just appeared on a stone and he read them off. And, some people really buy into that, and that's fine with me, but it doesn't make sense. And there's evidence that that's not what happened. And there's real solid evidence from the original manuscript itself. I went through in painstaking detail the original manuscript using some of Royal Skousen's research, but not his conclusions. I completely disagree with his conclusions, but his research is awesome. And you can see from the original manuscript and from the printer's manuscript, when you compare them, that Emma was the primary scribe for what we have today as the Book of Mosiah. Oliver Cowdery didn't write that at all. But he started with Alma, basically, maybe the last chapter or so of Mosiah. But Oliver Cowdery started with Alma, which means that it took David Whitmer said it took 8 months to translate. And the narrative we're all being fed now is that it took only 3 months, right, after Oliver Cowdery arrived. But if you look at what David Whitmer said, that means that Joseph and Emma started working on Mosiah around November through March. And that makes tons of sense when you look at all the historical references. What all that means is that the translation took longer than we're told, which means it was an actual translation. It wasn't just reading words off stone in a hat.
Yeah.
So that's one small part of the book. But
there's a lot of good information in that, and that's definitely something we'll have to talk about. Whatever happened to the golden plates? We mentioned that a little bit. We talked about the lost city of Zarahemla from Iowa to Guatemala and back again. We mentioned that early on in the episode. Right. Are there any other books that go along with this? I know you've done a lot. I was looking up, and you've got a lot of books you've done over the years. Is there anything else pertaining to this that you want to mention?
Well, as far as the first issue of the Times and Seasons, when I wrote the first one called Lost City of Zarahemla, I had a bunch of critics from the usual suspects, the interpreter and so on. And I thought, okay, what they didn't know is I had a ton more material that my publisher wouldn't let me put in the book because it made it too long. So I published the rest of it in 2 additional books. One was called The Editors, and the other was called Brought to Light. So someone who really wants to dig into the history of the Nauvoo and how the publishing was happening and so on, those 3 books are a complete set full of references that you can look up yourself to show that Joseph Smith really never edited the Times and Seasons, had very little to do with it. And who was really editing it was his brother and W.W. Phelps. And that's all significant because many of the things that are included in the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, he had nothing to do with. They just took these editorials out of the Times and Seasons and attributed them to Joseph Smith.
Right, they were all signed ED for editor, right? But they just
some
that had to have been Joseph.
Some of them weren't even signed ED, but the ones that were, they attributed to Joseph Smith. And if you analyze some of them were sort of, how would I put it? I don't want to say misogynistic, but they really were, because Benjamin Winchester was misogynistic. I mean, he once used as he was refuting someone who claimed they had visited an LDS church because they said that a woman gave a prayer, and Benjamin Winchester said, "We would never allow a woman to pray in church." That's how he was. Yeah.
Benjamin Winchester is the guy that kind of started this whole the Meso movement, right? He picked up on some of the information coming from Central South America and the stone temples, and was trying to put 2 and 2 together because he thought that would maybe help baptisms and help membership numbers.
Yeah, he thought it was because it was such a popular thing in the society in general that if he could link the Book of Mormon to that, it would get people to read the Book of Mormon, and that was his idea. So it didn't really work out that way, but
I think we're going to have to do another episode also just on that. I know you say that you're over the Meso thing, and I totally get that, but we'll have to, if you're up to it, talk about some of that back end stuff of where it all originated, make it easier for people to understand why it's not viable.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. We're going to put all this stuff in the show notes for you. Really appreciate your time and having you on the podcast. It's been a pleasure.
I've enjoyed talking with you about all this. Thanks for having me on.
And that's it, folks. What an incredible interview. Some of this might be common knowledge, but it is absolutely fascinating to talk about the plates, their location and movement in Joseph Smith's day, and what may actually have become of them along with the contents of the repository. The very existence of the repository of records is something that isn't known as well as it should be, and it fills in a lot of holes and questions surrounding the translation process of the Book of Mormon. I will put links in the show notes for Jonathan's books, and you can find them on Amazon as well as his website and bookofmormonevidence.org. That's it for this episode, folks. Remember to send your questions, comments, and hate mail to mormontraditionalist@gmail.com. Follow me on Instagram @mormontraditionalist for additional content, and until next time, remember, never back down from the truth.